Welcome to BYJU'S IAS and a very warm welcome to our weekly roundup of international events. We have been discussing crisis in international affairs for past few weeks. Most of them have been political crisis, military strategic crisis, at times even economic crisis, and how they affect the fortunes of big powers, small powers, superpowers, and how they change power equations. But crisis is a very misunderstood word in international relations. What happens is that if you look up the dictionary, it will tell you that crisis is a turning point in medicine as in any other field. Either things improve after a crisis, it is a critical turning point, or they deteriorate, often ending, hopefully not, in a catastrophic end. So when we talk in terms of a political crisis, we more or less imply that the flashpoint would either explode or the crisis would be managed and the crisis would be postponed. It would be a matter of a few days only. At times, exceptional circumstances, the crisis might continue for a couple of weeks. Whether it is an economic crisis, whether it is a strategic crisis, it's some kind of a confrontation between two powers. So either the tensions resolve, problems dissipate, or things are exacerbated. Military hostilities might be exchanged, there might be eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, or diplomacy will come to play and the summit conferences will reduce the tension. But when we talk in terms of another kind of crisis, which is very often heard in international relations, is a humanitarian crisis. Now, somehow or other, people have this misconception that a humanitarian crisis is of a lower order of priority than a strategic crisis or a diplomatic crisis or a military crisis or even an economic crisis. But before we proceed any further, let's try to understand what a humanitarian crisis is. The background of a humanitarian crisis goes back almost half a century, maybe a little more than half a century, when the Second World War was on and the Nazis were persecuting the Jews and the refugees were moving out in an exodus to other countries in Europe. As the Nazi influence extended, there was another wave of refugees, not only Jews, but all those who were resisting, protesting against the Nazis and fascists from European countries towards America also. This influx of refugees created a really high magnitude humanitarian crisis. But how was it humanitarian? This was not a military crisis. This was not an economic crisis. Although it had strategic implications, it had economic impact. I think the humanitarian crisis involves the element of compassion. When you say that like human rights, which are universal, indivisible, if there is a crisis which affects the destinies, the lives and deaths of fellow human beings on this planet, you cannot remain indifferent. So you have to have a degree of compassion, you have to have a degree of empathy, and you must intervene to reduce their suffering. It doesn't always happen. So when the United Nations was formed, the United Nations Commissioner for Human Refugees was appointed. Human refugees were supposed to be his charge, and then this office of the humanitarian relief to be administered was more or less handed over to him. Now, the relationship between human rights, humanitarian relief, humanitarian crisis is a very complex and intricate one. You also have this tangle with the refugees, asylum seekers, displaced persons. So this is the dimension of a humanitarian crisis, and why we are worried about discussing this crisis at the moment is that as soon as the government was formed in Afghanistan, the Taliban captured Kabul, another dimension of the problem opened up and people started saying, now we'll begin the humanitarian crisis. Now the people in Afghanistan, the internally displaced people, millions of Afghan refugees would create problems in the countries where they have sought asylum. There would be shortages of medicines, food stuff, security. So what does a humanitarian crisis comprise? That is the second problem which we must sort out before we proceed further. Humanitarian crisis is immediately a matter of life and death for people who are affected. There is starvation, there is malnutrition, there is lack of medical assistance, people cannot have access to education, their employment goes down the drain, and all this creates climates for political instability and creating a political crisis of unimaginable magnitude. The environments in which the refugees or displaced persons live creates conditions ripe for anarchy, for terrorism, for organized crime. So instability, in short. So this is what is, there could be even breeding ground for international terrorists, religious fanaticism, because a person who has nothing to lose doesn't believe that his life has any significance. It is a nihilistic mindset, it is a destructive mindset, it is a suicidal mindset which has implications for the whole world. It is like, do not ask for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Now, this sounds very nice in literature, sounds very compassionate in humanitarian moral terms, but this is not how international politics operates. Now, the other problem which we must try to cope with is what causes a humanitarian crisis. There are several causes. It could be a war, it could be a violent upheaval in regime, it could be an attempted genocide by an ethnic majority group, it could be an fanatical international terrorist group perpetuating religious fanaticism leading to it. So it could be anything, ethnic genocide. It could also be a natural calamity. You could have a tsunami, you could have an earthquake, you could have a drought caused by the climate change, and you would have people internally displaced, which are creating the same kind of problems as refugees across the borders. But we cannot overlook the fact that even if nature is involved, even if there is a calamity of nature, it is aggravated by human intervention. At times it is caused by human intervention. In most cases, the magnitude of the crisis becomes very important because it was not anticipated. It was thought to be less important than a political crisis or an economic crisis. Now, having cleared the slate to this extent, now we have to worry about one crucial problem about humanitarian crisis is the problem of constantly changing focus. What happens is, it is almost like every week or a month, a new humanitarian crisis emerges or glares us in the face. It could be Yemen, which is said to be the largest humanitarian crisis the world is confronted with. It could be Syrian refugees, a crisis of at one time unprecedented magnitude, putting great strain on Europe. It could be now the Afghan refugees. It is the interesting part or the tragic part about humanitarian crisis is that no part of the world is left untouched. In Central America, in Mexico, in Honduras, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, there are refugees trying to get into the United States of America. There are Cubans, there are Haitians. We shall talk about them a little later. So the American continent is not immune. Europe is not immune. Asia and Africa are not immune. South Asia and Southeast Asia are not immune, and the whole world is caught in this. So what happens is that the world's attention is sharply focused on one humanitarian crisis, but when the next humanitarian crisis comes, the focus shifts from the earlier crisis. So those people are more or less forgotten, and the word crisis, which was supposed to have dissolved in a few weeks at the most, lingers on for years. So the Yemeni crisis is almost completing 10 years. The Syrian refugee crisis has already completed a decade, and there is no stopping the tide of the Central American, Latin American refugees trying to inflow into America. So there are these issues. You can't have a humanitarian crisis for decades, because if you allow that to happen, people become numb by numbers. They cease to treat a crisis as a crisis, and that is where the real risk of a humanitarian crisis exploding in our face becomes very strong. Humanitarian crises are a crisis of a very special kind. You cannot hope or expect to diffuse them within a matter of days because the root causes are very, very deep. First of all, there is a divide in the world between the rich countries and the poor countries. In poor countries, the people lead lives which are very demeaning, which are almost like animals. And of course, it is natural for them to seek a better future, and they would push. And partly their lives are poor because they have been exploited. Their resources continue to be exploited by the multinational corporations of richer countries or powerful countries to the east. And what happens is they are burdened by debt. They are torn apart by tribal rivalries. And these are also the results of colonial rule which ended less than 6 or 7 decades back. So there is no equity in international system. So the people who are the wretched of the earth, to borrow the phrase of Paulo Freire, they want to push. They want to push towards the richer destinations where their life is better and they are willing to take great risks. The classic case of this is what happened in Syria. In Syria, the refugee crisis was triggered in 1911 by a very small incident when some teenagers drew graffiti on the walls and wrote anti-government slogans. The government came down heavily not only on these teenagers but on those people who were supporting, who had come out on the streets in their support and were raising slogans against the government. This led to a brutal backlash, and the Syrians started moving out to their neighboring countries, to Turkey, to Iraq, to Egypt, to as far as Libya, and hoping to go to even to strive on Lebanon and ultimately to reach Europe or go beyond. How they were responded was again very interesting, because what happened was the German Chancellor then, Angela Merkel, who herself had been a refugee once, who herself had seen what it means to be a displaced person, was very sympathetic to the cause of the refugees. But the other partners in EU were very apprehensive that once the refugees came to Germany, they would take advantage of the freedom of access to other countries, no passport checks, no barriers, and every country would face the burden. Also, the problem was when the Syrian refugees ended up in Germany and other countries of Europe in large numbers, they found themselves in a very different universe. They suffered from cultural shock. They had not stayed in Western democratic polities and societies. They were unused to urban life in a highly complex technological society. They clung to each other. They were loath to change their ways. The color of their skin was different. Their faith and religion were different. And the Europeans felt that there would be a threat to their way of life, the Christian way of life, the unity of the whites in a particular manner who have grown up in Europe with certain shared cultural values. This led to a certain amount of Islamophobia, which was, one doesn't wish to defend Islamophobia under any circumstances, but the cause was there that these aliens wanted to cling on to their way of life, were not prepared to assimilate, nor was the assimilation easy, because assimilation can only take place if there is a welcoming embrace on the other side. So this was one part of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. The second wave of Syrian refugees came when the fighting in Idlib was escalated. When the Islamic Emirate was trying to have ISIS and Daesh and occupying large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, people fled their brutal oppression and came out. There were some militia workers who took up the fight against these forces. Ultimately, the ISIS forces were defeated, but there was a residue of violence which continues till this date, and Syrians do not wish to return home till conditions normalize, and there doesn't seem to be any hope of happening that. Now, Syrians focused the world attention for quite a number of years, 3, 4, 5 years, and some of the problems of refugees were made clear. The other wave of refugees which came to Europe was from the northern African coastline. People from Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, when they were finding life difficult at home, they would head across the narrow straits of Gibraltar to Spain and then to other countries, maybe end up in France. This again, now the irony of this is that the people who were seeking asylum or refuge in European countries were themselves the deprived, disadvantaged sections of the European community. They were called pigs: Portugal, Spain, Italy and Greece. They were poor, financially irresponsible. They had probably a little more compassion about refugees, but they had no wherewithals to sustain them. So there were tragic cases of boats being turned back, illegal immigrants in rubber dinghies, young boys, girls dying on the shore, clinging to their toys. They were very moving pictures, but moving pictures also numb your sensibilities. After some time, there's just too much of this. You are anesthetized. You cease to have any compassion. This is what happened in European to Syrian refugees. The next lot was then the Afghan refugees, and the Afghan war, which has been fought in the landlocked country for 20 years, Now, no fault of the Afghans. The Americans decided to intervene there. They imposed a system which they could not sustain or protect. There was large-scale corruption, and the Afghans became victims of this humanitarian intervention there. Now, if you come to think of it, the Americans are past masters at humanitarian interventions, which leaves behind volcanic eruption of humanitarian crisis. Take the case of Saddam Hussein. It was a humanitarian intervention because Saddam Hussein was demonized. It was said that he was using inhuman chemical weapons against his own population, against the Kurds and opponents. There was a regime change, but there was no plan that what would happen after the regime change. So Iraqi economy was destroyed. Iraqi resources were taken over by the American contractors and companies. Same thing happened in Libya. So in both cases, what we witness, the humanitarian crisis, is created by a so-called humanitarian intervention unilaterally done by the Americans. Now, one can't blame America for everything, but in this case, in the case of creation of humanitarian crisis, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Syria, whether it is the North African continent, Libya, Iraq, you can't deny that it was a direct intervention, so-called humanitarian intervention, which created the crisis. The problem is that, as we pointed out earlier, that each new crisis shifts our gaze from an older crisis. So what about Yemen? The Yemen has the Shia Houthis, it has the Sunni elected government supported by Saudis. It is the Saudi military intervention to install a government which has been expelled by the Houthi rebels, on their part supported by their patrons, the Iranian Shias, threatening to strike oil refineries. And this again exposes to you how a humanitarian crisis also has linkages, inextricable linkages with an economic crisis, a strategic target, and then exacerbates the situation. Now, how do you provide humanitarian relief in a case of humanitarian crisis, whether it is Afghanistan today, whether it is Houthis for past 10 years, or whether Syria, where the fighting still goes on sporadically but very violently, because the task of providing humanitarian relief is severely obstructed by the ongoing violence. That's only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, which we said in the introductory portion of this talk with you today, that people think that the humanitarian crisis has a lower priority. Now, what is the lower priority? First of all, if you cut down economic expenditure earmarked for humanitarian relief or overseas developmental aid, you raise the budgets for armaments, production, exports, sales, etc., then how much money would you have to distribute all over these? The numbers add up. The numbers will add up to hundreds of millions. They would add up the people who are faced in Yemen with starvation, death, famine in next few weeks. If billions, hundreds of billions of dollars don't reach them, is larger than the population of many European countries. But we have no hopes that this aid will reach there for both reasons. Because the aid promised by major nations, the richer nations, is not even tens of billions. And what is required is hundreds of billions on a regular basis. Then also the security of the aid givers, the relief workers, is not guaranteed by either side of the combatants. So this is a situation where the crisis has lingered for a decade and nothing has happened. People have almost forgotten about Yemen. People have to be reminded that the capital is Sana'a. The port Aden was at one time a major British naval base, but Britain could not care less. It is quite unlike France, where something happens in Lebanon and President Macron is reminded of the glorious past of a glorious colonial past and is willing to come out helping. The British have cut down their overseas aid, but British are not the only one. The Saudis are a rich, oil-rich neighbor, but they, because of their partisan intervention, military intervention in this conflict, would have very little money or inclination, while it would be far-sighted, it would be good politics, good strategy to invest in rebuilding of the Yemen, providing immediate relief to them, so the stability of the state is guaranteed and they can have that. Another state which is facing the same kind of a humanitarian crisis chronically is Sudan. Earlier, Darfur was there, the drought was there, the people were suffering because of arbitrarily drawn colonial boundaries. So borders and refugees were a creation of colonialism, but the calamity was caused by climate change and nature, and the granting of independent status to southern Sudan hasn't changed matters any. And if you come to their neighbors, Ethiopia, which was once rich, which is supposed to be the cradle of human civilization, built a huge ambitious Renaissance dam, which again is threatening to create an environmental crisis, and also the ongoing civil war in Tigray, the northernmost part of Ethiopia. And again, it's ironical that this was the region where Eritrea's warfare with Ethiopia was stopped because of Prime Minister Abiy Ali's efforts, and he was given a Nobel Prize. But soon after he assumed power, what has happened is another civil war of greater magnitude has started. So this region, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Tigray, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Darfur, all these are humanitarian crises which have been not simmering but almost boiling for years. And what we said, people tend to forget one crisis when another crisis emerges and stares them in the face. So this is what we have to constantly keep in mind about humanitarian crisis. Complex root causes deeply entrenched, they have to be dealt with in a basis of a global cooperation is not likely to emerge, because the global conflict of interest among sovereign states, especially the big powers, is so acute that they hardly can be expected to cooperate in relief. There are also low priority given to human crisis. Humanitarian crisis means that the money required to cope with these crises will not be available when it is needed most. And then we don't know how it will spill over, what will be the effect. Take, for instance, the case of Rohingyas from Myanmar. Now, Myanmar has isolated itself from the rest of the world, the rest of the international community. It has almost, there is no other word to describe it, practiced a campaign of ruthless genocide against Rohingya Muslims. It is no point arguing that the Rohingya Muslims have been provoked, encouraged, abetted by the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, armed by Islamic terrorist groups. They provoked attacks on themselves by attacking the army. But it is not only the Rohingya Muslims. The military junta ruling Myanmar today has enemies on all sides, the Kachins, the Shans, the Mons, the Karins. But the rest of the world, on real political grounds, has turned a blind eye towards this humanitarian crisis. Very soon, Myanmar, earlier known as Burma, might also be confronted with food shortages, medicine shortages, problems created by unemployment, problems created by inflation, problems created by ruthless suppression of dissent, young losing all hope, and a civil war-like situation developing all along the periphery of its border. Now, once this happens, the Rohingya outflow to Bangladesh, via Bangladesh to India, and India's sensitivity to influx of refugees from its northeastern border, illegal immigrants, creating political instability in states like Assam, in states like Mizoram, Nagaland. Some of the refugees are kith and kin, the flesh and blood of the people living on the other side of the border. But national boundaries are considered to be sacrosanct. Citizenship is supposed to be the ultimate right. And how you check and how you expel illegal immigrants, humanely or otherwise, sows the seeds of a humanitarian crisis. So this is what we have to think carefully as far as all of this is concerned. Even in the American case, the Central American situation, how many countries are involved? Not only Mexico. Mexico is only the holding ground. It is the triangle of Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, further down Colombia, Venezuela, where from people in search of the better future keep coming. The Cubans, then the Haitians who want to escape either a despotic ruler or the pandemic or the earthquake or the hurricane or the cyclone. Nothing, and they have been ruthlessly expelled back. So this is what even the country which is made up of asylum seekers and refugees, that's how it treats the humanitarian crisis caused by refugees. And of course, as a sovereign country, it can decide a policy. But you cannot have double standards. You cannot talk in terms of a humanitarian crisis, cope with it. The whole of the world should unite and cooperate, and you yourself isolate yourself to protect your way of life, your prosperity, and your stability, however way you wish to define that. This is a problem which we have to live with, but live with a very uneasy conscience. Time to recap what we have covered in this conversation with you. The first thing to grasp and grasp firmly is that a humanitarian crisis is no less important than any other crisis. If we neglect it, we do so at our own peril. It is the humanitarian crisis which either results from a failure of crisis management, political or strategic or economic, or it is a humanitarian crisis which creates conditions for an intervention, a military intervention, an aggravation of civil war, or a violent change of regime which might create conditions for even a more cataclysmic humanitarian crisis. The second point which we should not lose sight of is there is no part of the world, hardly a major country, which is untouched by the impact of a humanitarian crisis, either near its borders or even far from its borders. It is caused by the basic divide between the rich world and the poor world, and as long as there is no equity in international economic system, as long as we do not have an agreement on the basic agreement about the quality of life of all human beings, it's very easy to pronounce that human rights are indivisible and universal. But when it comes to vaccine, they are not shared equitably. When it comes to food grains and consumption of food, not shared equitably. When it comes to energy, the priority of the richer nations to consume energy as and when they wish, they are not willing to turn down their thermostats even 2 degrees is another issue. When you profit from making military hardware and sell them for civil war with one side or the other side, you protect gun runners, you protect drug traffickers, and you turn an eye other side because you think this will hurt the adversary more. So this is what I think is the root cause of the humanitarian crisis. They are universal. They have to be coped with universally, but it is easy to be benumbed by each new humanitarian crisis and shift our gaze. So remain focused on the new humanitarian crisis, forget about the old one, let it simmer, it reaches a boiling point, it explodes, and then we don't know what is to be done. That's something which we do. And also, it is important for us to remember that we are not immune to this ourselves. As long as we have borders which are porous, as long as we have borders which are long with countries which are plagued by this problem more than we are, and some people think that we are also plagued by these problems of social discrimination, of mistreatment of minorities, of tribals being mistreated, and all these can spill over across the border one way or the other and become explosive. So we have to think in terms of pooling resources, first of all, anticipating, but the more important than anything else is that the politics has to be compassionate domestically, it has to be tolerant, and there has to be a shared urgency about humanitarian crisis. Otherwise, we don't treat them as crisis, we treat them as an endemic disease which we have gotten used to learn to live with it, like we are trying to learn to live with COVID. It can only lead to fatal consequences. Please think about it carefully. Pick up your illustrations. We have done some illustrations. Maybe you can pick up some more illustrations from all over the world. Try to think what can be done. You can't just make an appeal and see that people will contribute $5, £5, 500 rupees every week, every month to feed a child in Yemen, or for an Afghan refugee, or for a Syrian refugee, or to treat the Rohingya asylum seeker a little more sympathetically. We have to have compassion, but compassion is a very rare commodity in international relations. So think about it. Till we meet again next week. Goodbye.